Morning came quietly to the airfield, too quietly. For the men of the 8th Air Force, silence before a mission was never comforting. It meant anticipation. It meant time to think. And thinking, before flying deep into enemy territory, was dangerous. We want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Comment below and subscribe. The briefing room was packed. Cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air as the curtain was pulled back from the map. A red string stretched across occupied Europe, long, deep, and unforgiving. The target lay far beyond the range where luck usually ran out. This was not a milk run. Everyone in the room knew it. Daylight bombing over Germany was a calculated gamble. Fly high, fly tight, and trust the guns. That was the doctrine, but doctrine didn't stop bullets, and it didn't bring crews home. Among the bombers preparing for takeoff stood one B-17 that looked no different from the rest. Same olive drab paint, same white star on the fuselage. Same 4 engines that had to keep running if anyone inside wanted to see the ground again. Its crew went through the motions with practiced precision, parachutes checked, intercom tested. Guns loaded, no speeches, no dramatic goodbyes. Just quick glances that said everything words couldn't. They had flown missions before. They had seen bombers disappear in flames. They knew the odds. What none of them could know, what no one on that airfield could imagine, was that this aircraft would soon face more enemy fighters than most crews encountered in an entire tour. 30 fighters, 1 bomber, and a return that would later be described with a single word: impossible. But for now, the engines started turning, propellers bit into the air, and the Flying Fortress rolled forward, carrying a crew that had no idea they were about to enter one of the most unbelievable air battles of the war. The men who flew in B-17s trusted their aircraft with a kind of cautious faith. Not because it was comfortable, and certainly not because it was safe, but because, time and again, it proved that it could take punishment no other bomber could survive. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was never subtle. It was large, loud, and unapologetically built for war. 4 engines pulled more than 30 tons of metal through hostile skies. Its aluminum skin was thin, but beneath it lay a framework designed to stay together even when parts of the aircraft were literally shot away. What truly gave the bomber its nickname were the guns. By mid-war, a B-17 bristled with defensive firepower. Machine guns in the nose, waist, top turret, ball turret, and tail created overlapping fields of fire. In theory, an enemy fighter attacking from any angle would be met with bullets. In theory, reality was far messier. Guns jammed, ammunition ran out, gunners were wounded, and German pilots quickly learned how to exploit blind spots, attacking head-on at closing speeds that left seconds to react. Inside the aircraft, there was no room to move freely. The fuselage was narrow. The temperature at altitude dropped far below freezing. Oxygen masks were as essential as parachutes. A single hole from flak or gunfire could depressurize the plane instantly, turning loose objects into deadly projectiles. Yet despite all this, the B-17 earned a reputation that bordered on myth. Aircraft returned with tails half torn off, with engines missing, with wings shredded and cockpits destroyed. Some crash-landed, others barely made it back to base. But they came back, for crews, that mattered. Because when fighters appeared in the distance, small dots growing fast, belief in the Flying Fortress was sometimes the only thing standing between panic and survival. And on this mission, that belief would be tested far beyond anything its designers had ever imagined. A B-17 was never just a machine. It was 10 men, locked together in a narrow aluminum tube, each one responsible for keeping the others alive. At the front of the aircraft sat the pilot and co-pilot, young men, often barely in their 20s, carrying responsibility far heavier than the aircraft itself. One flew the bomber, the other watched the engines, the instruments, and the sky, always the sky. Just behind them was the navigator, hunched over charts and instruments, guiding the aircraft across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. A single mistake could mean getting lost, falling behind the formation, or running straight into enemy defenses alone. Next to him, the bombardier lay in the nose of the aircraft. From this position, with almost nothing but glass between him and the air rushing past, he aimed the bombs that justified the entire mission. When the bomb bay doors opened, there was no turning back. Above and behind them, the flight engineer manned the top turret. He monitored fuel, engine performance, and fought as a gunner when fighters attacked from above. In combat, he was both mechanic and defender. Farther back, two waist gunners stood opposite each other, weapons pointed through open windows into empty sky. They were exposed, vulnerable, and among the first to take hits during fighter attacks. Below them, curled into the cramped bull turret, was perhaps the most vulnerable man of all. The bull turret gunner flew head down, surrounded by nothing but thin metal and glass, scanning the lower sky for fighters coming up from beneath the bomber. At the very rear sat the tail gunner, alone, watching the direction enemy fighters favored most. If he failed to spot them early, no one else could. They came from different cities, different backgrounds, and different lives. Some had never left their home states before the war. Others had already lost friends in the air. What united them was simple. Once the wheels left the ground, there was no escape. No retreat. No help coming from below. If the flying fortress survived, they survived. And if it didn't, none of them would. The bomber formation stretched across the sky like a moving city of metal. Dozens of B-17s climbed steadily, their engines droning in unison as they crossed the coastline and left friendly territory behind. Below them, the land changed. The sea gave way to fields, rivers, and rail lines, all of it enemy territory now. Somewhere down, there were radar stations tracking their approach. Somewhere else, pilots were already being briefed. Inside the aircraft, the temperature dropped as altitude increased. Frost crept along the interior walls. Oxygen masks were pulled tight, turning voices into distorted echoes over the intercom. The crew settled into a tense routine. Engines, checked and rechecked, guns, tested, safeties off. Eyes, constantly scanning the sky. At first, there was only flak. Black bursts appeared in the distance, then closer, then uncomfortably close. Each explosion was a roll of the dice. The sound of shrapnel striking aluminum was sharp and unmistakable, like handfuls of gravel thrown at high speed. The bomber shook, but held formation. Flying in formation was survival. Each aircraft's guns overlapped with the next, creating a defensive web that made direct attacks costly for enemy fighters. Falling out of that formation meant isolation, and isolation meant death. The navigator called out headings. The bombardier checked his instruments again and again. The pilot kept his hands steady on the controls, resisting every instinct to dodge the flak that bloomed around them. Then, someone spoke the words every crew dreaded. Bandits. 3 o'clock. High, tiny spakes appeared against the pale sky. At first, they looked almost harmless, then they grew fast. The gunners tensed. Fingers wrapped around triggers. The comm routine vanished in an instant. The enemy had arrived. And this was only the beginning. The first enemy fighters came in fast and confident. They didn't circle. They didn't hesitate. They attacked head-on, where the bombers' defenses were weakest and the closing speed was almost unimaginable. In seconds, the sky in front of the B-17 filled with streaks of fire. The nose gunner squeezed the trigger, the aircraft shuddering as the machine guns came alive. Tracers tore through the air, converging on shapes that grew larger by the heartbeat. Fighters, 12 o'clock. The sound inside the aircraft was overwhelming. Engines roared. Guns hammered. Wind screamed through small gaps where bullets had already punched through the fuselage. The first impacts came without warning. Metal tore. glass shattered. A burst of cannon fire ripped through the nose, sending shards of plexiglass spinning through the compartment. The bombardier was thrown backward, his oxygen mask yanked loose before he could grab it again. The B-17 lurched, but the pilot forced it back into line. German fighters streaked past, so close that some crew members later swore they could see the pilot's face. Then they were gone, looping around for another pass. Smoke filled parts of the aircraft. A warning light flickered on the instrument panel, then stayed lit. Engine 3's hit. The flight engineer scrambled, checking gauges as fuel pressure dropped. Somewhere behind him, a gunner shouted that his weapon had jammed. This wasn't a probing attack. It wasn't a warning. It was an attempt to kill the bomber quickly, before it could reach the target, before the formation could react. As the fighters regrouped for another run, the crew realized something terrifying. They weren't being singled out by accident. They were being targeted. Staying in formation was everything. Every bomber crew knew that. But formation flying demanded precision, and precision vanished the moment damage began to pile up. The B-17 struggled to hold position as engine power fluctuated. The pilot compensated instinctively, adjusting throttle and trim, fighting to keep the aircraft aligned with the bombers around him. Then the flak hit again. A violent explosion rocked the aircraft from below. The bomber dropped suddenly, alarms blaring as the formation surged ahead. Altitude loss. The pilot pulled back hard, but the response was sluggish. The aircraft was wounded now, heavy, unbalanced. For a few seconds, the bomber hung on the edge of the formation, close enough to see friendly aircraft, far enough to feel exposed. That was all the enemy needed. Fighters broke away from the main group and turned toward the struggling B-17. They had been waiting for this moment. A single bomber, no longer fully protected by overlapping guns. The formation moved on, not out of cruelty, not out of indifference. There was nothing they could do. Radio calls crackled, then faded as distance grew. The bomber fell farther behind, the protective wall of flying fortresses shrinking into the distance. Inside the aircraft, the reality set in. They were alone. Attacks came from new angles now. From above, from below, from the sides. The tail gunner called out targets almost continuously. The waist gunners fired until their barrels glowed faintly red. Another fighter pass sent cannon shells, ripping through the fuselage. One engine coughed, then steadied, but leaked fuel visibly into the slipstream. The pilot made a decision no one wanted to make. He turned slightly away from the formation, choosing control over cohesion. Staying with the group at all costs would tear the aircraft apart. From this moment on, survival depended on the crew alone. No escort fighters in sight. No friendly guns nearby. Just a damaged bomber, deep over enemy territory. And the enemy knew it. The sky around the lone B-17 was suddenly alive. Enemy fighters appeared from every direction, above, below, head-on, and from the rear. Not in a single wave, but in coordinated attacks, taking turns, giving the bomber no moment to recover. This was no longer combat. It was a hunt. The first group came in from high 12 o'clock, diving steeply. Cannon fire ripped through the air, slamming into the nose and cockpit. The bombardier ducked instinctively as fragments tore past his head. One round punched straight through the nose, missing him by inches. Almost immediately, another group attacked from below. The bull turret gunner called out targets, his voice tight but controlled. He fired in short bursts, tracking fighters as they climbed toward the bomber's belly. One aircraft broke away trailing smoke. Another kept coming. The bomber shuddered violently as shells struck the underside. The bull turret filled with the smell of burnt powder and oil. Inside the aircraft, the situation deteriorated fast. A waist gun jammed. The gunner fought it desperately, fingers numb from cold and adrenaline. The flight engineer shouted warnings as engine temperature spiked, Hydraulic pressure dropped. Control forces grew heavier with every maneuver. Then someone screamed over the intercom. A fighter had come in from the rear, firing directly into the tail. The tail gunner returned fire until his guns ran dry, then called out again, wounded, but still conscious. The attacks didn't stop. Fighters came in pairs, then trios, then larger groups. Each pass stripped away more of the bomber. Control cables were damaged. Oxygen lines were severed. Blood pooled on the metal floor, freezing almost instantly. At one point, a cannon shell exploded inside the fuselage without detonating fully, a miracle in itself. Had it gone off, the aircraft would have been torn in half. The crew lost track of time. Minutes felt like hours. Every new attack felt final. And still, the B-17 stayed in the air. Somewhere between the 15th and 20th attack, something changed. The fighters grew more cautious. Ammunition was being spent. Fuel was being burned. The bomber, impossibly, was still flying. By the end of the engagement, nearly 30 fighters had taken turns attacking the same aircraft. And somehow, against all logic, it had not gone down. But the battle had left scars that threatened to finish the job. The flying fortress was alive, barely. Make sure you're subscribed. You don't want to miss what happens next. The attack slowed, but the danger did not. Inside the B-17, the crew faced a new enemy, their own aircraft. Warning lights glowed across the instrument panel. One engine was running rough, another was leaking oil fast enough that its failure was only a matter of time. Control responses were delayed, uneven, unpredictable. The pilot tested the controls carefully, afraid that a sudden movement might snap a damaged cable or tear loose a weakened surface. Behind him, the flight engineer worked non-stop, rerouting fuel, shutting off systems, and monitoring temperatures that refused to stay within safe limits. Every adjustment was a gamble. The wounded were tended as best as possible. There was no medical equipment beyond basic first aid kits. Bandages froze stiff within minutes. Blood soaked into flight suits and crystallized in the cold air. The tail gunner's position was nearly destroyed. Part of the fuselage around him was torn open, exposing the interior to the rushing sky. He stayed at his post anyway, scanning for fighters that might return. Communication became difficult. Intercom lines crackled or went silent entirely. Crew members shouted, using hand signals when words failed. The navigator rechecked their course repeatedly. They were off track, not dangerously lost, but far from where they were supposed to be. Fuel calculations were revised again and again, each time with less margin for error. Then came another problem, the bomb bay doors. They had been damaged during the attack, and now refused to respond normally. If they couldn't be secured, the aircraft would bleed speed and altitude the entire way home. Assuming home was still reachable, the crew improvised. Using brute force, coordination, and more than a little desperation, they managed to force the doors into a partially closed position. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. For the first time since the attacks began, there was a moment, brief and fragile, where no one was shooting at them. The crew understood what that meant. If the fighters returned, the B-17 would not survive another sustained attack. Every man inside the aircraft now fought a quieter battle, keeping the bomber together long enough to escape enemy airspace. An escape was still far from. Minutes passed, then more minutes, and no new fighters appeared. At first, the silence felt wrong. After so much chaos, the absence of attack was almost unsettling. Every gunner stayed alert, scanning the sky, expecting the next wave to appear at any second, but it didn't. The navigator was the first to say it out loud. They're gone. There were reasons for that. German fighter pilots were aggressive, but they weren't reckless. They had limits, fuel, ammunition, and orders that couldn't be ignored. Chasing a single, heavily damaged bomber deeper toward friendly territory risking being caught low on fuel or intercepted by Allied fighters. There was also something else: respect. Veteran pilots on both sides recognized when an aircraft refused to die. A bomber that had survived repeated attacks, absorbed enormous damage, and continued flying was no longer an easy kill. It was a liability. The Flying Fortress had done what it was designed to do. It had made itself too expensive to finish off. Some enemy pilots likely assumed the bomber would crash on its own. Many damaged aircraft did. They bled fuel, lost engines, and fell out of the sky hours after the fighting ended. There was no reason to waste more men and machines on something that appeared already doomed. Inside the B-17, the crew didn't celebrate. They knew better. The most dangerous part of the mission still lay ahead. The long, lonely flight back across hostile territory with a wounded aircraft and no margin for error. The enemy had backed off, but survival was still very much in doubt. With the enemy gone, the crew could finally take stock. The B-17 was scarred, bruised, and bleeding, but it was still flying. Every man inside understood that every second counted. The closer they got to friendly territory, the better their chances. But the journey home was far from simple. Engines coughed and sputtered. Leaks spread silently through the wings. Control surfaces responded sluggishly. Every minor adjustment demanded full concentration. One mistake could send the bomber into a spin, from which it would never recover. The navigator studied the charts obsessively, recalculating heading after heading. With a damaged radio and inconsistent instruments, even small errors could put them miles off course. Over enemy territory, a miscalculation could be fatal. Inside, the crew moved like a well-oiled machine, despite exhaustion. Wounded men groaned softly as the cold seeped in. Gunners rotated positions to stay alert, hands stiff and trembling from frostbite and fatigue. Every face was pale, every movement deliberate, every breath measured. Outside, the landscape stretched endlessly, dotted with towns and rivers that should have meant nothing. Now they were threats, or checkpoints of hope. Each mile closer to Allied lines was both relief and reminder of the fragility of their situation. The bombardier, shaken but alive, kept watch on the sky. He scanned constantly, expecting enemy fighters to reappear at any moment. The tail gunner, bloodied and bruised, refused to let his weapon rest, even though the last attack had been minutes ago. They could not afford complacency. The pilot adjusted the throttle continuously, coaxing every ounce of life from engines already strained to the breaking point. Even a gentle gust of wind could destabilize the damaged aircraft. Every maneuver was a negotiation between survival and physics, a silent conversation between man and machine. Hours felt like days. The crew shared no words beyond necessities. The hum of engines and the occasional rattle of loose metal filled the silence. Thoughts wandered to home, to family, and to the improbable fact that they had made it this far. And then, on the horizon, a line of familiar countryside began to appear. Green fields, familiar rivers, and airfields known to the Allies, the first sign that the nightmare was nearing its end. But the journey was not yet over. Every foot closer was a test, every mile a fragile thread, holding them in the sky. The bomber had survived enemy fighters. Now it had to survive itself, 1 mile at a time. The airfield came into view like a lifeline, a patch of concrete surrounded by green, a place where the B-17 might finally stop bleeding and the crew could step onto solid ground. But landing a damaged Flying Fortress was no simple task. The pilot adjusted the throttles carefully. One misstep could send the bomber skidding off the runway, or worse, tearing apart before it even touched the ground. Control surfaces were stiff, and one engine refused to respond fully. The aircraft lurched slightly with every gust of wind, reminding everyone inside that it was still very much alive, and still dangerous. The flight engineer monitored temperatures, oil pressure, and fuel levels. He relayed urgent adjustments to the pilot, each one critical. One wrong move, and the hours of survival would end in seconds. The gunners, exhausted and blooded, stayed in their stations, eyes scanning the horizon one last time. The sky was clear, but years of habit didn't vanish in an instant. Danger had been constant. Caution remained instinctive. The approach began. The bomber descended slowly, wheels extended, flaps adjusted. It shuddered as the landing gear locked into place. Every vibration, every lurch, was a reminder of how fragile victory could be. Then, finally, the wheels touched the runway. The aircraft bounced slightly, then settled. The pilot applied brakes carefully, coaxing the wounded giant to a stop. Engines roared in protest, but held. Silence fell. Inside, the crew stared at each other in disbelief. Injuries, frostbite, bruises, and exhaustion didn't matter in that moment. They had made it. Against impossible odds, the flying fortress was still intact, and its crew was alive. Ground personnel rushed toward the aircraft, jaws dropping as they saw the damage, holes everywhere, missing panels, and wings scarred by flak. Yet here it was, a battered miracle on the tarmac. For a moment, no one spoke. The enormity of what had just happened hung in the air. The B-17 had faced 30 enemy fighters, sustained severe damage, and yet it had returned. Not as a theory, not as a story, but as a living testament to the resilience of men and machine. The crew climbed down, their legs shaky, their bodies sore, but their hearts beating with relief and disbelief. They had survived, and the world would remember. The B-17 sat on the tarmac like a ghost of its former self. Closer inspection revealed just how much it had endured. Bullet holes riddled the fuselage, wings, and tail. One engine was barely hanging on, oil streaking down the nacelle. Panels were torn away, exposing wiring and systems that should have been protected. Even the landing gear showed signs of stress from the battered flight. Inside, the crew counted their injuries. Cuts, bruises, frostbite, and fatigue, all badges of survival. No one had died, but almost everyone had been touched by danger in some way. Blood still stained the floor and seats, a silent record of what had passed through the aircraft. Mechanics shook their heads. They had seen damaged bombers before, but never like this. Some parts of the fuselage were nearly paper-thin, pierced by dozens of rounds. The tail section, normally one of the most durable areas, had been hit repeatedly. And yet, somehow, the bomber had flown. The crew told their story to ground personnel and officers, detailing wave after wave of enemy fighters, the system failures, and the improvisations that had kept the aircraft aloft. The room grew quiet as the officers realized the odds that had been beaten. Every repair estimate, every evaluation, confirmed it. The flying fortress should never have returned, but it had. The damage was extensive, the story unbelievable, and the lesson clear. In war, courage and skill could stretch beyond the limits of machines, and sometimes, against all logic, triumph over death itself. Survival in war is never random. There's skill, preparation, design, and luck. For this B-17, it was all three, pushed to their absolute limits. First, there was the aircraft itself. The flying fortress was built to endure punishment. Its structure, armor, and redundant systems allowed it to keep flying even when heavily damaged. Engines could run even when one or two were failing. Control cables could snap without sending the plane into an unrecoverable spin. Bullet holes, flak damage, and torn metal often left it crippled, but still capable of returning to base. Second, the crew. Each man knew his role, and they executed it perfectly under extreme pressure. Gunners continued firing even when wounded. The pilot adjusted for ailing engines and compromised controls. The navigator recalculated courses in real time. The bombardier and flight engineer improvised, patched, and compensated for every system failure. Without their skill, discipline, and sheer determination, the aircraft would have been just another wreck over enemy territory. Third, tactics and decision-making. The pilot's choice to break slightly from the formation, the crew's ability to prioritize critical repairs, and the coordination during each attack turned what could have been instant destruction into a prolonged struggle, giving them a chance at survival. Every maneuver, every choice, mattered. Finally, there was luck, simple, unexplainable luck. The B-17 avoided direct hits to its most critical systems, enemy gunners misjudged angles, and critical shots missed by mere inches. War is cruel, but even in cruelty, chance can intervene. When these factors combined, something remarkable happened. The bomber absorbed nearly 30 enemy fighters' attacks, survived catastrophic damage, and landed safely. A miracle in the eyes of those who saw it, but also a testament to preparation, courage, and resilience. It wasn't magic. It wasn't inevitability. It was survival, honed by engineering, training, and human will, and, for a fleeting moment, extraordinary fortune. The story of one B-17 facing 30 enemy fighters is more than an extraordinary tale of survival. It is a reflection of what the Flying Fortress represented in World War II. The B-17 was not just a bomber, it was a symbol of determination, ingenuity, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Designed to fly deep into enemy territory and return with both crew and payload intact, it embodied the daring strategy of daylight bombing that defined the air war over Europe. Its lessons extended beyond the battlefield. Every mission tested not only the aircraft, but also the men who flew it. Training, teamwork, and trust became as crucial as the design of engines, guns, and armor. The Flying Fortress demanded courage from its crews, but it also rewarded skill and discipline with a fighting chance. Stories like this B-17 survival inspired generations. They became legends within bomber groups, teaching new crews that even the most damaged aircraft could return if handled with care, determination, and come under pressure. Every dent, every hole, every engine that barely kept running told a story of human will intertwined with engineering brilliance. The legacy of the Flying Fortress is also one of sacrifice. For every story of survival, countless others ended in tragedy. The B-17's durability allowed many crews to return home, but the price of the air war was staggering. Remembering these aircraft is inseparable from remembering the men who flew them, the missions they endured, and the skies they dominated. In the end, the Flying Fortress was more than a machine. It was a testament to what could be achieved when human courage met technological innovation, and when survival against impossible odds became, for a brief moment, reality. One aircraft, one crew, one mission that should never have ended in survival. The B-17 had faced what seemed impossible. 30 enemy fighters, relentless attacks, critical damage, and the constant threat of failure. And yet, against every expectation, it returned. Not in theory, not in legend, but in reality, alive and bearing the scars of combat like a warrior bearing medals earned in blood. The men who climbed out of the aircraft that day were changed forever. They had stared death in the face and lived. Every scar, bruise, and frozen fingertip was a reminder of how close they had come to never seeing home again. And yet, their story is not just about survival. It is about courage, skill, discipline, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. It is about a machine designed for war that became more than metal. It became a lifeline. When we look back at this mission, it reminds us why these stories endure. They capture the tension, the terror, and the improbable triumphs that define the human experience in war. They honor those who risked everything and sometimes, against all odds, came back alive. The Flying Fortress, battered but unbroken, sits in our memory, as a symbol of endurance, and the story of this one aircraft and its crew continues to inspire awe, respect, and wonder, a testament that even in the darkest skies, survival is possible, and heroism is real. One aircraft, one crew, one impossible return. What do you think about this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Support the channel by subscribing and sharing this story with your friends. It helps a lot.